Good afternoon. Hope everything is going well. Today is the inaugural video post from What the Hell is Architecture? And what better subject to tackle for our first video than something as polarizing, as controversial as something happening in our current political climate? That item being Trump's executive order on promoting beautiful federal civic architecture. Issued last week on the 21st, a draft of this has actually been floating around for the last few months and has been gaining a little bit of attention since then. Not as much attention as I would have thought. At the time of recording this, no one on YouTube is talking about it, and any kind of research you do on the internet is just most of the same stuff you always see of newspapers with their one sentence headlines that are very clickbait, and they're just meant to kind of make it a liberals versus Republicans item. But there's so much more to talk about that, and so that is why I'm making this video, and I don't just enjoy talking to my camera for hours at a time. The other reason we need to talk about this is with everything going on with COVID and debating on the election, etc., this is just an issue that isn't getting any attention at all, which is not very uncommon for architecture. It seems like many people outside the industry kind of don't care about it, but this one has a lot of impact on their lives. And the few people who have actually talked to me about this all seem to have the mentality of not being aware of it or just not seeing what the problem is. And so we need to spend some time to talk about that there are quite a few problems with this architecturally. A quick disclaimer, this video is not going to be me foaming at the mouth and just screaming about what I love or what I hate about politicians or the president. I've already accepted that the comment section of this video is going to turn into the two-sided screaming match you see everywhere on the internet. But what this video is about is looking at the executive order almost line by line and explaining all the problems with it. Not just politically, but architecturally, from an architect's perspective. Having said that, now feel free to jump into the comments and write every nasty thing you can about me. I'm a very easy target. So really quick, just a brief explanation on, my background, who I am, and why I feel like I should talk about it. I am a licensed architect. I am on the Rochester AIA Board of Directors, the American Institute of Architects. I was the Director of Government Affairs. I've moved into Director of Education. I have an extensive background in government projects. I, within a year or two ago, went off and started my own firm, which is residential. And I still am a practicing architect, but I also do teach at a college level. And so, that is who I am. I'm aware that almost none of you know who I am, and so that's why I feel like I can at least talk about this. Now, I encourage everyone to visit whitehouse.gov and read this executive order in its entirety. Don't worry, it's not that long. Because while we're going to comb through it in a lot of detail, as much as I try to keep my bias out, this whole video is me expressing my architectural bias. So before we start, I would urge you to read that and then maybe come back and listen to my opinions. Now, for those who didn't take my advice and didn't read it and are just going to hear me talk, a very quick summary on this is simply the idea that any government or publicly funded building over a certain amount of money has to adhere to a certain architectural style. It's referred to as federal neoclassical in this, and for those of you who aren't familiar with that style, think of the White House or any government building of that scale: white marble, big concrete columns, custom ornate decoration. And so sadly, for those who don't read the order, the first thing they do is they go onto Google, search it, and all you get are those one-sentence clickbait argumentative headlines I referred to earlier. So one of two things happens. If you support Trump, you just say something about how it's not a big deal. And if you don't support him, you talk about how it's a bad idea and how he's a bad president. Whoever posts first, it doesn't matter. The other side starts arguing, and then you get that yelling match you see everywhere. No one learns anything, and no one actually understands what the order is. So that's why we need to dive into it a little more. Again, full disclosure on my bias, I don't support it, as you know by clicking on this and reading the title. But there are reasons why. It is not just about Trump. And therein lies the first real big problem with this. Whenever somebody talks to me about it, the architectural style being mandated is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what style was listed. You can't mandate a style. No style of building is perfect. It can't be placed everywhere in the world. So when you start having this federal mandate, whatever style is picked doesn't matter. You just don't want to pick a style. And we will talk about why that is. Again, I'll keep disclosing my biases. I personally hate the style that's being proposed, and we'll talk about that as well. But I do need to make it clear, it doesn't matter what style is being proposed, you just can't mandate an architectural design. And so we've talked long enough without actually diving into the executive order, and so we're going to start now. And so the first thing is an introduction in which Trump describes why he thinks this style of architecture is beautiful and why we need to use it for these buildings. And you have better things to do than to listen to me read it to you verbatim. So we'll just summarize it with one quote that kind of encapsulates the entire introduction pretty nicely. Notable founding fathers agreed with these assessments and attached great importance to federal civic architecture. They wanted America's public buildings to inspire the American people and encourage civic virtue. They sought to use classical architecture to visually connect our contemporary republic with the antecedents of democracy and classical antiquity. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Reminding citizens not only of their rights, but also their responsibilities in maintaining and perpetuating its institutions. The executive order then goes on to list a few buildings that Trump feels are great examples of the style of architecture that we're trying to emulate here. And I'll place them on the screen so you can get an idea of what this type of architecture looks like. All right, so right out of the gate, we have an issue in this executive order that it's listing all these buildings and the specific building type and claiming that they're very successful and they're perfect examples of beautiful architecture that encompass the idea of government and civic authority. And it's a little subjective. I won't argue whether I think that's true or not. But it then talks about the fact that they were tied to the ideas of Athens and Rome because a new democracy was forming. But here's the problem. We are not forming a new democracy anymore. America's formed. It's been there for a little bit, and it hopefully will still be there. So this idea that we need to keep emulating this historic style doesn't make sense because the reason it was created is not as relevant now, and it won't be any more relevant in the future. So we can't keep churning out the same type of historical building. Everything evolves, not just style, but material, construction methods, and many other things we're going to talk about. In fact, a perfect example of this is something that the executive order then goes on to talk about, and that is modernist buildings. For those of you who are not familiar with the architectural styles, I'll place some modernist buildings on the screen. But to put it simply, modernist buildings were very utilitarian, concrete structures that didn't have a lot of ornament and were very functional. And so they're actually called out by name in this, in that around the 50s, the federal government was building too many of these and that they're all ugly and failures. Again, I'm not going to place my opinion on the style, but it's a perfect example of, in the 50s, everything was being built modernist because of the time. And so why is it not okay to do it here, but it was okay to do it with the federal neoclassical? The executive order then goes on to discuss about the fact that around the 1950s, the government created the guiding principles for federal architecture, which were a set of rules and guidelines that federal buildings had to follow. Unfortunately, it mistakenly claims that these rules required high-priced architects in very ugly modernist buildings, which is not true. There is language regarding contemporary modern architecture, and as I just said, in the 50s, modernism was everywhere. And so the idea that these rules are creating bad buildings is not fair. Let's pause quick, though, to stress this point that it doesn't matter which style is more effective or successful than another one. There is no perfect style. There can't be any style that's mandated. And so we're going to talk about which styles might be better than others, but again, none of them need to be federal mandated. None of them can be federally mandated. Now, I'll avoid too much history lessons because it's not what we're here for. But around the 90s, those guidelines would actually evolve into what's being used today, and that's the Design Excellence Program. It's administered by the GSA, General Service Administration, and it is a much more complex but also peer-reviewed program. Federal buildings go through reviews from professionals in the industry. And unfortunately, they actually come under attack in this next paragraph, which we're going to use this quote to kind of summarize. Under the Design Excellence Program, GSA has often selected designs by prominent architects with little regard for local input or regional aesthetic preferences. The resulting federal architecture sometimes impresses the architectural elite, but not the American people who the buildings are meant to serve. Many of these new federal buildings are not even visibly identifiable as civic buildings. Now, I'll try to keep this as short as possible. Here's something I have a very personal objection to, ethically. And that is, this is another piece of political content that is purposely framed in a way to kind of create two sides to fight each other. This mention of the architectural elite, and again, I'm taking this personally because I'm an architect, but it's just like everything else you see where everything is spoken or framed in such a way that it offends one side to get them fighting. Because when you have two sides fighting, you don't have to solve anything. You can let them argue it out. And here's a perfect example. This idea that architects are all arrogant and they think of themselves as elite and that the general public is beneath us is a problem. And it's another big reason I thought this video needed to exist. The AIA, the American Institute of Architects, released a statement condemning this executive order. And if you go on Facebook or LinkedIn, which is supposed to be a little more professional, if you make the mistake of going through the comments, it's instantly, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's everyone who supports Donald Trump saying that architects are arrogant and they have no right to fight this. They're just hating Trump, so they're avoiding this. And then sadly, everyone in the industry, particularly architects, are explaining that they hate this, but they don't do a good job of explaining. So you get this us versus them, Trump did a bad job or Trump's doing a good job. And it's right here in the executive order. This idea of the architectural elite is a problem I have personally. Now we need to move past this. I could make a whole video on this, and I promised I wouldn't do that. With a government background, though, I can say that public jobs are not just handed to architects or contractors or engineers. Publicly funded work has to go through a process, and I'll keep this short, but it has to go out for a public bid. You have to write a proposal. That proposal has to be publicly reviewed. It's all public knowledge. Schedule, time, idea, all that, it's public. And so this idea that famous architects are handed big buildings is wrong. Now, I won't deny that there are very famous buildings that are ugly and fail, and the winning architecture firm might have gotten it because they were famous, but they weren't handed it, they had to win it from a proposal. And so that is a problem, that architects are not just given stuff. I'm sure they are, but in a public realm, that's not the way it is. And I will say, I just so it doesn't look like I'm pretending to be unbiased, but clearly just railing against Trump this whole time, there are definitely high-profile public buildings that are very ugly and very poorly designed. So I don't disagree with that. But this was not the way to handle that, and this is definitely not the solution. Now, as I said, I want to get off this fake elitist attitude argument. I don't want to harp on it. I know I personally have had this discussion with a few people, and I know other architects are as well. The idea that when we voice our opinion, we're seen as arrogant and all-knowing, and that's just not the case. We'll talk about it more later. But if you've looked at the examples of this style of architecture, I cannot think of a building that is more wasteful, inefficient, cumbersome, and obnoxious as this classical style. So if you make the argument that elitist architects want to do ugly buildings, this building type in particular is the most elite I can think of with very little benefits. Now, we'll talk about that in the second half of the video. So we've covered so much content so far, and we haven't even moved past the introduction. And so moving into the next part is the policy. And this is where, as we've summarized, it states that federal buildings over a certain cost need to be this federal neoclassical architectural style. Now, I don't want this video to be me responding to every horrible negative comment I saw on AIA's statement on LinkedIn, but there's one in particular that needs to be addressed, and it comes up in the policy. And there are many people, and a very small number in the industry, who are claiming the executive order doesn't force this style. It actually has language to allow you to do others. Now, that's not true, and we'll go into that, but just so it doesn't seem like I'm taking it out of context, what they're referring to is the quote I'm about to read to you from the executive order. Where the architecture of applicable federal public buildings diverges from the preferred architecture set forth in subsection A of this section, great care and consideration must be taken to choose a design that commands respect from the general public and clearly conveys to the general public the dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability of America's system of self-government. Now, I can already sense the devout kind of followers of Trump pouncing to the comments to explain to me that this video is a waste of time because the order isn't forcing it, it's just saying it's preferred. And I'll ask that you hold your horses. I'm sure I can't stop you, but we are going to talk about the fact that this line is kind of window dressing. Yes, it says that you can use alternative styles when not applicable, but not only is that really vague and when it can't be applicable, but we're actually going to see that there's actually a lot of language that makes it so deliberately difficult to veer from this that it's directly discouraging it and almost making it impossible. We'll go into that in more detail, but the reality is this style is being mandated, it's being forced. I'm not sure if this sentence, if this quote was supposed to make it look like it was to try to trick us, or if it is, if they really did want to have alternatives and they've just done a poor job of executing that. But therein lies probably one of my biggest problems with this executive order. I already mentioned the idea of vague language. This entire executive order is very subjective. Nothing is measurable, nothing is quantifiable. And again, this is not a new thing for architects. Design is very subjective. But because of that, all the language in this is very open to interpretation or deliberate misinterpretation, depending on who's enforcing it. And so there is the problem, is that this can be kind of malleable and used in any way someone wants to, and that's the biggest danger of it. Now, that vagueness and subjectivity is dangerous, but it could almost be forgiven as long as further on in this executive order, someone isn't giving himself too much power that could be exploited or change a narrative to fit whatever he's trying. And yes, I am aware I'm a very shitty actor. I am absolutely implying that Trump gives himself way too much power later on. And so this subjectivity isn't just dangerous, it's purposely used later on in this council that we'll talk about so that he can do whatever he wants, or any president who keeps this could do whatever he wants with it. Now, it's not all bad. This section closes with a statement that the GSA needs to interview and include future users of a building as well as the general public in some of the decisions. I am all for that. Public engagement is very important in this. Now, there is, of course, a limit, as anyone who knows who's attended a zoning or planning meeting. A lot of times the general public just seems hardwired to hate, halt, and interfere with every construction effort out there. But I do think we need to include the public more. The problem is, again, what is the point of getting local input if it's a federally mandated style? And so it almost contradicts itself in that paragraph again. Now, before we move on to the next section, one thing I feel like we should discuss, and I know it's giving ammunition to people who might want to leave nasty comments against me, but there is a lot of attacks against the GSA in this executive order. And it would be remiss of me not to mention that it does seem to be a coincidence that the GSA and Trump are not having a great time right now with all this election debate. And so the timing is off, is very odd to begin with, but it does seem like this is almost a last minute insult to a government agency that isn't exactly in favor with Trump. That could be my own personal bias, but the timing does seem to line up a little bit. Now we move on to the section discussing the President's Council. And earlier in the video, I said that the subjective language is probably the part I have the most issue with. I misspoke. This is the part I have a real issue with. Basically, it's a council made up of people that we will discuss that are going to oversee these project proposals, and that they will approve and deny building problems, and they will also provide input. That's not the most concerning part. We'll talk about what is a little concerning a little later. What is the most concerning is who this council is made up of. So I apologize, you'll have to see the top of my head while I read off. So this council is specifically listed on who will serve on it. And so the council shall be composed of, first, all of the members of the Commission of Fine Arts, the Secretary of the Commission of Fine Arts, okay, the Architect of the Capitol, great, the Commissioner of the GSA Public Building Service, great, the Chief Architect of GSA, great, other officers or employees of the federal government as the President may from time to time designate, which is a little weird, and up to 20 additional members appointed by the President from among citizens from outside the federal government to provide diverse perspectives on the matters falling under the Council's jurisdiction. That is a big problem. We'll go into that, though. And then finally, the Council shall be chaired by a member of the Commission of Fine Arts designated by the President. So, again, I'm not a great actor. Those last three bullet points are a real problem. We'll talk about the Council in general, but those last three are what's most concerning. So, hopefully nobody pounced on the comments to type up something that the President won't give himself too much power. He has nothing to do with the Council. Because, yeah, he's not physically going to sit on the Council, but as we just listed, he personally appoints most of the members. Because the language is so vague, again, the Council members can be as many as needed, but excluding the one that's very vague, there could be 21 members on this Council that are personally designated by the President. And so anyone who wants to tell me that handpicked people from the President aren't going to do his bidding and voice his opinions, sadly, I'm going to be a little condescending and say that's incredibly naive. He might not be sitting there, but he has 21 people who are there for him. And here's an issue where I have to kind of break my pseudo-professionalist attitude for a minute. I think something I really don't like here is, of all these members on the Council, which can be anywhere from 20 to 40 or 50 people, there's only 2 architects. I know I can't avoid posting this video without being accused of architectural elitism, but why would you not include architects in something like architecture? I run into this personally myself. Nor do I think any architect thinks that only we are qualified to handle building problems and that the general public needs to be left out. I don't think any of us say that. I know I personally don't. But we're never part of the conversation, and it's very odd. You don't walk into a courtroom without a lawyer. Nobody asks their friends to perform surgery on them because they're kind of smart. And yet, why is it architects are never asked about architecture? So, I don't like this council, but if it has to stay, which it probably does because I don't have any power to change it, can we get more architects to talk about architecture? It's very difficult to become an architect. It requires a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, a lot of commitment. So, it would be great if we were actually part of this. That's something, and again, I've already gone on too long. I'm going to have to move past this, but where are the architects on this architectural council? I know I'm harping on this section too much. This council is probably the part I have the most issue with, so I want to move past this. I don't want this to be one note video. But not to get too nitpicky, there is some language in here on that council members are not entitled to compensation, but they are entitled to government-funded subsidies and per diems and other monetary benefits. And so again, I don't know if this is deliberate, so it's saying that they shouldn't be paid, but that they can be. And I know from my personal experience, and I'm sure everyone is aware, government projects are very expensive and very time-consuming. So all I can see when I read this is that here's another layer of red tape of very high-up federal officials. So every project just got a ton of time added to its schedule, and probably a lot of money. And that money comes from all of us. So that's another nitpicky problem I have with this section. Now, at the closing of this council section, there is language that states that if a building veers from this federal mandated style, the president is to be notified and the president needs to weigh in on whether to move forward or to deny that accidental approval of the incorrect style, I guess. And so again, I've harped on the president gave himself too much power by having all his council members. But even if this style isn't enforced and the council agrees to it, the president still gets to step in and stop it. So, I'm going to be accused of overanalyzing this, but it's pretty much this executive order says that the president gets to design buildings. He gets to provide input, he gets to approve or deny. I've talked to a lot of Trump supporters. I don't think I've ever met one so devout as to say that he understands construction and buildings and he has an eye for architecture. And yet he is designing buildings and putting himself in a position of an architect. I don't think any of his followers will state that he has that qualification. So why is he legally getting the power to do so? One final note before this starts to sound like a conspiracy theory video. That language I just talked about actually specifically mentions that if a brutalist building, which is another architectural style, or a modernist building or deconstructivist is approved, then the president really needs to be notified. And so this might be, again, kind of overthinking it, but the amount of times that modernism and brutalism are specifically mentioned in this order, there are a lot of styles. Those two get more mentioned than anything else. It's hard not to think that Donald Trump probably hates those styles and he may have had a bad experience. And so this executive order almost seems like, similar to the GSA, kind of a last-minute attack on these styles that he really doesn't like. He specifically calls them out by name a lot, and so it does seem like this is more of a not promoting something he likes, but almost getting rid of something he doesn't like. And again, as we've talked about, federal mandates of styles, approving or denying, is a problem, especially based on a personal bias, without working in the industry. So that's the executive order in a nutshell, and what I'm going to guess that a lot of people are asking, and quite a few have straight up asked to my face, okay, who cares? Well, if this video wasn't clear, architects care for one. When this draft was revealed months ago, I don't have the exact number, I believe it was something like 11,000 practicing architects wrote letters and sent emails to Donald Trump explaining that this was a bad idea and even detailing why it's a bad idea. Now, I can already predict a lot of people weren't impressed by that 11,000 number, but as of this year, the United States has less than 109,000 practicing architects. So that's 1 in 10 architects did not like this and needed someone to know about it, much like I'm doing with this video. But that only goes to show that there has to be more that didn't like it but didn't write about it. And so, again, maybe that 1 in 10 number is not very impressive. Maybe you'll indulge me in saying 2 or 3 more architects didn't like it and didn't write about it. If you walk in a hospital and 3 or 4 of every 10 doctors and nurses you pass tell you to avoid this certain room or you'll get a certain disease, you're not going to go to that room. You're not going to say, well, they don't unanimously hate it, so it's fine. I think when a large amount of a dedicated professional force agree on something, I do think we need to listen to it. And here's an example. Most architects are vocally telling us this is a bad idea. So instead of accusing the elite of not caring, maybe we need to listen a little more on why they don't like it. But it isn't just architects. Many people in the industry, engineers, contractors, have a lot to say about this. I won't speak for them. I'm not in that field. I'll certainly invite any of them to leave a comment or reach out and we can talk about it further. But there is a specific professional organization called the ICAA, and that is an architectural group dedicated to classical architecture. They have flat out said that they do not support this. So the group who wants more buildings to be classical style is saying that this is not a good idea. I know that might not sway everyone, but that should have some merit. Now, I do want to talk about the specific style stated. I've told you I don't like it, but I want to talk about why. But before we get into that, there's a few reasons I feel like this video needs to exist. Again, not just because I like to talk at my camera for a few hours. First of all, I'm aware that this video is not going to get me a friend request from Donald Trump. But this is not another video railing against Trump. He gets special mention because he wrote this. But again, too much political content is just people either saying they love Trump or hate Trump, and then nothing is discussed or resolved. There is a problem with this executive order, not with the person who wrote it. Now, I've made a few biased comments, but that's one reason I think this needs to be discussed. Another reason I'm posting this is based on a very similar idea that, unfortunately, to my disappointment, a lot of professionals, a lot of professional organizations have simply stated that they condemn this order, and then they've said something like, Trump screwed up, but hopefully Biden will be smart and get rid of it. And that's a problem. I would love to see Donald Trump get rid of it. I don't think he cares about things I post. I hope that Biden gets rid of it because I don't think any president needs this. I don't think it's just Trump. I don't think any president should have the power listed in this executive order. But I don't like the attitude of, well, this president screwed up, so let's hope someone does a better job. I think we all need to be out there explaining why this matters. I'm aware that nobody cares about anything that's not based on the election or COVID, but there are other political items, and this is one of them. And so, sadly, there's a lot of content out there that's just, liberals versus Republicans. But in reality, this is a problem for either side. And so that's another reason I think this needed to exist. Now, hopefully we can move past some of the controversy of political ideas, and we can talk about the style itself. Again, I'm going to harp on this for the third or fourth time now. There is no style that should be mandated. But since this has been called by language and mentioned a few times, I think we need to talk about why this style in particular is a problem. One of my bigger fears is a lot of people I talk to kind of have this mentality of, well, the White House looks really nice, so what's wrong with that building style? Well, there's a lot wrong with it, and so let's talk about that. Now, one of my first problems with this style is that a lot of people do find it beautiful and very inspiring, and it does look like a significant building. Most people who feel that way, though, are not people with a mobility problem. These buildings always like to, have a design that shows they're very significant and very important, and so often they lift themselves on a podium of big steps so that you are literally ascending to this lofty building. The problem is, however, that those big podiums built of giant concrete steps are very beautiful, but they're not accessible. Not just for someone in a wheelchair. Anyone with a crutch or a mobility problem cannot use these buildings the same way people without a mobility problem can. And so I'm sure someone will want to tell me that, well, with a ramp or elevator, that solves that problem. The problem is if you've ever visited these buildings, not only because they were built hundreds of years ago, but those beautiful photo moments that these steps provide don't ever account for ramps and railings and elevators. So these accessibility measures are usually tacked on and kind of hidden in the back. So someone who unfortunately does have a mobility problem is kind of treated like a second-class citizen and has to kind of scamper in through a back entrance that's not nearly as glamorous or beautiful. And yes, I am aware that I'm still bitter from the months I had to use wheelchairs and crutches, and even non-federal buildings have this mentality. So there's the first problem. Universal design is how we need to do our buildings. This style, probably more than any other, is just not accessible and provides a lot of problems. Now, I think the thing that was most surprising to me is that, first of all, not many people were opposed or even aware of this, but those who are aware of it don't talk about construction cost. I don't know if this is an industry secret I'm about to share. Politicians don't fund government buildings with their salaries. You pay for it, I pay for it, we all pay for it. And so when things are expensive, we all are paying for it. And so this style has to be one of the most expensive building types out there. I don't have the specific numbers. I'll gladly look into it for anyone curious, but building a building out of polished white marble and giant concrete podiums and custom concrete columns and 30-foot floor heights with custom decorative ornate orders on top of each column, I shouldn't have to tell you that those construction costs didn't just increase. They may have legitimately doubled or tripled. And so when you have to pick a style, I don't think there is any style, but picking one that's going to cost everyone way more money is a problem. Contractors don't price based on the size of a building. It's based on complexity and materials. And so when you pick something that's very complex and uses the most luxurious materials, this is a huge taxpayer burden. Now, while I'm recording this, I can use my psychic powers, and I can already feel that people are going to bring up the fact that this executive order only counts for federal and public buildings over a certain amount of money. And so there will be those that say that it doesn't matter, anything under it doesn't count, anything over it, should be this grandiose building type. And that's a problem. First of all, construction for government projects is incredibly expensive and time consuming. So when you argue that a cost threshold will keep it out, more projects are going to breach that threshold than you probably think on a daily basis. So this is going to affect a lot of buildings. And so that's the first problem I have with that mentality. The second thing wrong with that mentality is whenever, rules and regulations are created regarding monetary limits, which does happen a lot, you do unfortunately get a lot of gaming of the system. And so by this executive order kind of creates a cost ceiling. And so anyone who wants to avoid building this type of building, which I hope I've convinced will be a lot of people, now you have to keep all your projects under a certain amount of money. And so that's a problem. And I know you're probably asking, well, what's wrong with cheaper buildings? I don't want to keep paying for expensive things. And I understand that. The problem is if a building isn't built correctly the first time or isn't built to its full extent that's required, that's going to cost you more money. Here's a very simplified explanation. If you have 5 home improvement projects and you get a quote that it's going to cost $50,000 to do them all, and so somebody might say, well, I don't want to pay $50,000, so they might ask for 5 quotes for each project. Those 5 quotes aren't going to be $10,000 each. They might be $15,000 to $20,000 each. So you can either do all 5 at once for $50,000, or you can do all 5 at 5 different times for $100,000. Yeah, the second option doesn't cost you as much up front, but you've just paid significantly more money. Here's a perfect example. And government buildings, as I keep harping on, are expensive and are time consuming and will get much worse when you add this 30-person council of federal people who don't know what they're doing. And so this cost ceiling is only going to make stuff cost more because people are going to have to come back and add on to it. And so, I'm going to keep harping on it, but the money is a huge issue, and I think that's what should make people a lot angrier. And my final problem with this style is the executive order keeps prattling on about how important local and regional context is and how we need to design buildings that are beautiful and kind of fit where they're being built. So this style in particular, it will look out of place in anywhere but Washington, D.C. The White House is a beautiful building, but if you put that in the middle of any downtown city except where it is obnoxious, it would not look good, it would have no context, it would be an eyesore. And again, I've mentioned I don't want this video to rail on Trump, but it's kind of hard not to think that this executive order is calling for a style for a building type that he spent the last 4 years living and working in multiple buildings. It's kind of hard not to think that maybe all that time spent in these buildings has made him believe that they're beautiful and perfect without realizing that outside of a political setting, this style has no business being anywhere. And so if we're trying to match local and regional context, this is legitimately the worst style of building to try to mandate. Not that there should be any mandate. I hope I made that clear 5 times. So anyone still with me at the end of this video, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. If you were patiently waiting so you could have ammunition to post hateful comments against me, I appreciate that. Feel free to let loose. For those of you who did kind of enjoy what we talked about, I'd love to hear about it to counteract some of the negativity I'm sure I'll get. There's, unfortunately we had to go through this very fast. There's so much to cover here, and to keep this video at a length that people would even consider to watch, we have to summarize a lot of it. I'm not a big fan of commentary videos that don't kind of summarize their thesis, the problems, and what the call to action is. So for those of you who skipped to the last 30 seconds here, let's quickly go through here. First of all, an overall summary, which I'll take right from the title of the video. This executive order was very misguided. It takes no professional account from architects. So architecturally, there's a lot of problems, and politically, there's a lot of problems. I'll avoid all the low-hanging fruit that people have been posting, insulting Albert Speer and all the fascist regimes that do this mandate. But there is a problem with mandates, and moving past that, hopefully you can see that from a cost perspective and a few others. All right, so what's the call to action? Well, first of all, care about architecture and talk to architects. That's my own personal bias, because that doesn't happen enough in my opinion. But honestly, tell a politician that you don't like this executive order, and maybe elaborate on why you don't like it, because I'm sure they filtered through a lot of hate mail. I don't like the wait and see attitude. I'd love to see this rescinded now. I'm aware that Trump has a few other things on his mind in these remaining few weeks, but it doesn't mean we couldn't have some small chance to change it. Now, if that fails, which it might, I can't imagine Donald Trump's watching this, I will certainly hope that we can put enough pressure on Biden to get rid of this, and not just get rid of it as the typical new president mocks the old president by getting rid of his laws that he thinks are stupid. Maybe understand why this is a problem and why no president should be involved with this. So I'm always happy to discuss any architectural or any item with anyone. My email's in the description. Please feel free to reach out. It'll be a while before architecture's back in the spotlight, as we don't often get a lot of the limelight when it comes to controversial political items. But hopefully we can talk again soon. Thank you and have a great day.